And then I'm going to go to you and make you co-host. Maybe that's better.
Okay, let me see if I can. It says host disabled attendee screen sharing still, so.
Okay, change host. You're now the host.
Let me try one more time. Okay. Okay.
So you're going to screen share.
Okay, can everyone see that?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. And everyone can hear me, right? Okay, so I'm not sure what kind of pre-introduction that there was, but my name is Sienna Shar. I graduated from the MEM program in NREM last semester. Wow, it feels like an eternity ago. But I'll be starting law school at William S. Richardson School of Law at the end of this month. I'm scared. And this is my MEM capstone research that Dr. Cox and I worked very closely on, and we're hoping to publish at some point this year. But yeah, it's entitled Managing Nearshore Fisheries in Hawaii, a Policy Analysis of the State's Marine Aquarium Fishery. So my presentation will follow the outline of my final report, which I submitted for NREM 696, the MEM capstone course. I'll start with a short background before moving through my motivation and objectives for this work, followed by my methods, results, discussions, and key takeaways. The global marine aquarium trade primarily involves the wild capture and sale of ornamental fish species, sharks, crustaceans, and live corals for public and private exhibition in aquariums. This global industry is valued at between 200 to 300 million US dollars, which amounts to the annual harvest of over 20 million marine fish and 1.5 million live stony corals originating from at least 45 countries. Aquarium collectors harvest species off of Hawaii's reefs and distribute the bulk of them overseas, and harvesting for this fishery occurs predominantly on the islands of Oahu and Big Island. Hawaii's marine aquarium fishery has been extremely conflict-ridden since its inception. Events like the ones depicted in the two photos on the left, which show hundreds of dead ornamental fish that were discarded in a harbor dumpster, have sparked public outcry across the state. These issues are mainly because of complex conflicts between stakeholder groups and fishers, generally concerning overharvesting, wasteful practices, and disagreements on whether the fishery is sustainable and socially equitable to all stakeholder groups. These stakeholder conflicts and concern over the fishery's sustainability have spilled over into the legislative arena. In recent years, major changes include the voiding of all permits in 2017 and Department of Land and Natural Resources Chair Suzanne Case mandating the environmental impact statements be completed for Oahu and Big Island. This is a little bit out of date, but at the time of this research, the Big Island EIS was awaiting review and potential approval. It was denied. These recent legislative changes, however, tie into my motivation for this work. The knowledge gap that I'm addressing in the research is to provide estimates of all economic costs and benefits of this fishery, because this was largely unaddressed in the EIS. My hope is that instead of overlapping with the environmental impact statement, my research can be used in conjunction with it for near future policy determination. My specific objectives were to estimate the economic costs and benefits, as well as to identify and discuss the qualitative and intrinsically valued elements of this fishery. Also to explore multiple policy alternatives, and finally to develop recommendations for this fishery. So by achieving these objectives, this analysis will serve to inform the state's top decision makers, allowing them to make weighted decisions on the management and future of the marine aquarium fishery in Hawaii. So the approach that I used for this project was adapted from the Eightfold Path, which is a method of policy analysis that includes 8 steps, which I've outlined here. I started by defining the problem by identifying the research gap using a preliminary literature review. Then I assembled evidence to gain a better understanding of the fishery, which aided in the development of my motivation and goals for this project. I constructed policy alternatives by examining what had been done in the past in the state legislative system and in other fisheries around the world through extensive literature review. I then selected the criteria to analyze and compare across these alternatives by identifying the costs and benefits associated with each policy scenario. I projected the outcomes for each policy scenario using CBA and sensitivity analyses. I then compared the trade-offs across policy alternatives. I identified the scenario that resulted in the largest net benefits to the state and across stakeholder groups. And finally, I'm telling the story here in my presentation and hopefully in a publishable work. I also want to take a moment to highlight the importance of these two steps in my methodology. Constructing alternatives that were viable and feasible for the state was key. This research hinged on this jumping off point so that all of the costs and benefits associated with these scenarios could be investigated. Next, exploring how the direct, indirect, and non-market costs and benefits accrue to different stakeholder groups provided me with an outline of the distributional issues associated with this fishery. Sustainable management requires that social equity associated with harvesting this public resource also be addressed. I included qualitative, intrinsically valued elements of the fishery and how costs and benefits accrue to different stakeholder groups because I felt that equity and power issues are not so easily understood or weighted as heavily as direct market benefits are by policymakers. So these are the 4 policy scenarios that I explored. Scenario A represents the status quo in 2019, which is when I began this research. For this scenario, all permits were voided by the Hawaii Supreme Court. And however, the fishery continued across most of the state due to a loophole in the ruling, which with the only exception being a complete moratorium ban on part of Big Island. There were also loopholes in that and people kept fishing. Scenario B represents the permitting system that was in place in 2016 and before the 2017 voiding of permits. And like scenario A, this scenario exhibits high exports out of the state, income flow to stakeholders directly involved in the fishery, and a slew of unknown impacts to other fisheries, the environment, cultural resources, and tourism. Scenario C represents a statewide aquarium collecting ban, which would halt all collection and exports. And scenario D represents an alternative permitting system that would allow permit holders to collect for captive breeding purposes and would allow special exemptions for research. The characteristics noted on the right of the table aided in the identification of the costs and benefits associated with each scenario. Next, I generated a table like this for each of the policy scenarios with the costs and benefits that are associated with each. I didn't have time to include them all in my initial PowerPoint, but I have them at the end of this PowerPoint if you guys have questions about the other tables. This specific table is of the costs and benefits associated with scenario C, the statewide aquarium collecting ban. Since not all costs and benefits can be monetarily valued, I labeled them as estimated or described. The estimated costs or benefits are based on existing literature or pulled directly from fishery data. For example, tourism losses avoided were estimated by using existing literature that specifically estimated the value of Hawaii's on-reef tourism industry. Things like boat tours, snorkeling, diving, and swimming were all included in this estimation, and qualitative elements of the fishery like social costs and environmental costs were described and justified also using existing literature. The third column, titled Impacted Stakeholder Groups, identifies the groups that are impacted by each cost or benefit. For tourism losses avoided, the benefit of tourism accrued to tax-paying residents who rely on tourism-related jobs and economy fed by the tourism industry. Tourists who gain non-market benefits by being able to visit Hawaii and experience on-reef tourism. And finally, the state management agencies, who rely on a healthy economy to receive their funding and budget. So now on to the actual analysis portion of my research. As I mentioned in my methods overview, and probably the reason why I'm here today is because I use the cost-benefit analysis, which is, I hope you guys know, is a systematic decision-making tool used to evaluate the efficiency of potential projects and policies. This is possible by assigning monetary values to costs and benefits that include both direct market, indirect market, and non-market goods and services. So in order to know which policy scenarios are most efficient and equitable, ranking and comparison methods need to be used. A common method for comparing across alternatives is the estimated net present value, or NPV. which is the sum stream of benefits minus the sum stream of costs, which have been discounted to account for temporal differences, which I'm sure you guys know this. I'm sorry for going over it. In this case, NPVs for each policy scenario can be compared against the NPV for the status quo, and the alternative with the highest NPV would be the preferred choice in this case. I also use sensitivity analysis, which is a necessary part of any CBA because it allows for the incorporation of all qualitative or intrinsically valued elements of the fishery to be factored in. And in this case, all described costs or benefits were investigated using a range of values to determine how sensitive the NPV is to changes in these variables. So moving on to results, here are the net present values for the four policy scenarios over a 30-year time frame, to the year 2050. I decided on using a 30-year time frame based on critical climate change predictions predominantly. As you can see, scenario C, the statewide aquarium collection ban, was the most preferred choice and the only net positive NPV. The NPVs were not sensitive to changes in the discount rate nor other sensitivity analyses that I ran, meaning that when all of the intrinsically valued elements of the fishery were assigned ranging values, the overall outcomes of the analyses was the same. The low end and high end ranges were generated by assigning each cost or benefit a high and low estimated valuation based on existing literature or valuation pulled directly from raw data. In the other scenarios, the costs, generally indirect or non-monetary, were borne by large groups of stakeholders, while the monetary benefits accrued to one small group of stakeholders. Scenario C also benefits the greatest number of stakeholders out of all of the policy scenarios that were explored in this study. So moving on to a bit of discussion, a large portion of the distributional issues that I observed and identified through my research were issues regarding which stakeholder groups bear what costs. Current and recent past measures, specifically scenarios A and B, have almost solely benefited the stakeholder group with the smallest number of individuals, commercial collectors and wholesalers in the state, while simultaneously neglecting the larger groups who bear the most indirect market costs. These inequities were highlighted in my research by connecting impacted or benefited stakeholder groups to respective costs and benefits associated with each policy scenario. So for example, in the case of Native Hawaiians, due to the extractive nature of this fishery and the targeting of largely native and endemic species, Native Hawaiians suffer losses of fish species that may have cultural and subsistence value to them. More generally, residents suffer the consequences of more degraded ecosystems, which lessen ecosystem services. Essentially, they're paying the costs for fish to be taken off of Hawaii's reefs. Market and power structure of this industry was also explored through observation and literature review with focus on past socioeconomic studies of the Hawaii fishery. By comparing 2016 catch data with 2016 export reports, I discovered that over 95% of the ornamental species caught in Hawaii are exported. And for half of the species that I investigated, that number exceeds 100%, which means that catch reports are either underreported or are not being filed at all. I also investigated online pricing information for fish originating from Hawaii. The mainland sellers' prices were on average 3.4 times higher than the retail prices offered by the local seller, with a range of 1.5 to 5.1 times higher price in US mainland markets. This finding supports the claim that out-of-state retailers selling directly to consumers realize a larger percentage of gross revenues than in-state retailers do, which was really alarming for me. And essentially the value added by out-of-state retail sales is leaking out of the state's economy. This table highlights why my research is valuable and why the CBA method should be used as a tool for future policy determination regarding this fishery. Comparatively, the EIS completed by the Stantec consulting firm based its recommendations predominantly on direct market benefits, most notably how this fishery provides jobs and tax revenue to the state from the estimated 185 fishers and wholesalers who directly participate in the fishery, which is a really small number. Whereas this policy analysis factors in direct and indirect market and non-market costs and benefits associated with each policy scenario, and found that the statewide aquarium collecting ban was the most equitable and efficient scenario for the state and all involved stakeholders. The EIS produced a recommendation that monopolizes the state's marine aquarium fishery, and essentially proposed permits to 14 permit holders in West Hawaii, banning all others from collecting. While the EIS did superficially explore other recommendations, it didn't explore alternatives that would involve moratorium or ban of the trade. And finally, this report was produced with no monetary or personal ties to any industry or managing agency, whereas the EIS was funded by the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council, who is a major proponent of keeping the marine aquarium fishery and industry alive in Hawaii. And looking ahead, like I said earlier, we do plan on submitting this research for publishing consideration, and also disseminating it in a few different formats to ensure that it's accessible to the general community, the greater research community, and all relevant policymakers and resource managers. The expected outcomes associated with disseminating this information is that the hope that Hawaii's policymakers and resource managers will be able to make more informed, complex policy decisions that affect Hawaii's marine aquarium fishery based on the best available data, predictions, and analyses. I also believe that future researchers looking at fisheries that pose similar wicked environmental problems should consider employing a similar approach to the methods used in this study in order to guide decision-making. And finally, as this analysis is compared to that of the EIS for Big Island, it's increasingly apparent that managing agencies should employ analyses that, to a certain extent, are standardized and don't focus solely on or primarily on short-term direct market benefits, and instead get a more complete long-term picture, as this cost-benefit policy analysis did. And with that, I'd just like to mahalo Dr. Cox for doing this work with me and inviting me here today. And I'm ready for any questions you guys might have. Thank you. And I can't see the chat, so if anybody's
I can't see the chat either.
Oh, sorry. I think if you click, so you see how you're sharing your screen. If you click,
I've got it. Did you click the chat box?
Okay, yeah, okay.
I loved your presentation. I thought this was really well presented. Like, just your tables were really clear, everything. I guess my question is, how does the permitting work from the DLNR, and like, are you anticipating like any, I don't know, like, can you explain that a little bit more?
Well, I guess it depends on like when you're talking about, because in the different policy scenarios, they sometimes factor in different years. So for one of them, I was talking about permitting in 2016, which is different than permitting now. So there's been a lot of phase shifts in this fishery. So different areas have had access to permitting at different times, depending on essentially changes in the legislative structure, things that are happening in the legislature. People are, for example, recently the Supreme Court asked for a moratorium for Big Island, and before that, that's where most of the fishing was happening. So essentially, it's super easy, or it was super easy to get a permit. There's two types of permits, commercial and non-commercial. Non-commercial permits are free, and there's a limit on catch, but they're very high limits. They're not really evidence-based fishing limits. And then for commercial permits, I think currently they're $50, but then you also have to pay for a general commercial fishing license, which is $100. So that's about $150 to run a business selling, capturing and selling fish in Hawaii, depending on where you are in the state. So yeah, so there's been different closures. Right now, Big Island is having a moratorium, but I allude to this in my paper that people are still fishing those areas, and few people have been fined and caught recently. But yeah, sorry to get back, I'm going on a tangent, but to get back to your question about, I don't know, it's just really easy to get a permit. So I guess I don't know how to be more specific with that question.
That boggles my mind that it's like that easy to get a permit, and like there's not, it doesn't seem like there's much enforcement like with regulating numbers, especially like when you think about it, you have the tragedy of the commons at hand as well.
Yeah.
And if it's like $50 to get a permit and you can make bank off of it by selling to this, like there's not really an incentive.
The other issue is that there was voluntary catch reporting. So that was another huge issue because there isn't a lot of enforcement out in the water. You're on a boat, you're diving down with scuba. So there's not a lot of enforcement unless another boat's out there, they see you and they call it in. And then, an agent will meet you at whatever harbor you pull up at, if you're lucky, to check your catch. But other than that, enforcement is really minimal. The actual export of fish is the enforcement and management of that is also extremely minimal. They're not, making sure that you're claiming the right fish when you're exporting them, things like that. So yeah, we're losing a lot of fish and we're losing a lot of money because of this fishery. So that was definitely some very concerning findings when we were finishing up this research.
And so those folks who have fished in areas that were off limits and who were caught, what agency was like enforcing that? Was that still DLNR or?
DLNR met them for the ones that I'm talking about. There were 3 fishers who were caught just at towards the beginning of this summer. DLNR met them and checked their catch. They were fishing off of the Big Island, and that was a moratorium area. So they got their boat taken from them, all of their gear, all of the fish were returned, and they were looking at fines, really high fines. I can't remember the exact number, but in the tens of thousands of dollars. And they were extremely reduced at the end of whatever happened. I think that they had to pay like $1,000 in fines or something like that, because they were essentially, it was supposed to be $300 per fish, per illegal fish, and they had hundreds. And then they reduced that to a really small number, like $5 per fish or something at the end of it. So they're not even really keeping those strict regulations.
Yeah, that's crazy to me, because like even if you don't have as much like personnel to enforce like to come down to the docks every day and like to monitor catch limits, like you can still make an example like when you do catch someone and like keep that high level of enforcement, so then you kind of scare folks like, oh, if I get caught it's going to be really bad, versus like backing down and being like, oh yeah, we're just going to give you a slap on the wrist. This is a huge issue.
Yeah, and that's what we were hoping for. We were hoping for those really huge fines. And actually, 2 of those 3 people who got in trouble were on the list of the 14 proposed permit holders for West Hawaii that I mentioned earlier. So they were actually going to be actively participating in the new fishery that the EIS had drawn up, and they were named when we asked about who were the 14 proposed permit holders, and they were on there. So you can kind of get the feel of, who's taking our fish. It's not just people, it's not our, law-abiding citizens, it's people who are out there and just kind of decimating our reefs and not really following the rules. So it's very concerning.
And have they looked into fishing practices that they're using? Like, are they causing like any reef damages themselves? Like, just like maybe like, I don't want to say like trawl netting or like bottom trawling or anything like that, but like how are they catching these fish?
So they're catching them with fine mesh nets. So there's certain regulations on like the centimeter size of the nets that they're using. The problem is, like I said, they're using scuba, so it's pretty much impossible to know if they're, my understanding is that really the only like solid and reliable way to catch reef fish is with fine mesh nets. and they use kind of like a bubble stun gun. So they like shoot the bubbles at the fish. It kind of stuns them, and then they net them. Before that, they were using more destructive practices, and in third world countries, they're still using destructive practices like cyanide. They put some cyanide near the reef, and then the fish go unconscious, and then they collect them that way. So, and even, probably like 10 years back, they were collecting some of the rarest stony corals and soft corals from Hawaii, and they would go to super deep depths, and they'd break off chunks of coral. And there wasn't really a limit on that. So yeah, I mean, it's hard to know what they're doing now and what they're not doing, because there's not really a good trail as far as exports, as far as who's getting what. There's a lot of black market stuff happening. It's actually, Dr. Cox knows this, but it's really hard to get information about this fishery. People are so secretive about it. The only way I could get prices was to do online searches for prices, because no one would share pricing information with me because I'm an outsider. So you can kind of get the feel for, like, they probably have tens of species that aren't even listed, that are, super rare species that, they've collected one or two of, and that they're super expensive, and that we don't even know about at this point. And they could be like, the last surviving pair of whatever fish, and we'll never know.
I can't, like, when Dr. Cox was talking about this earlier, I just couldn't wrap my head around the fact that, like, DLNR is providing these permits for such a low cost without, like, understanding, like, the ecological impacts of this, like, fully. It just seems like, as you were saying, like, they're getting, like, rare species potentially, and that might be, like, I don't know, like, I feel like there's not enough, like, ecological research for this fishery to still even be a thing.
Yeah, I agree. What they were using for a while is that DAR does put out reports every, I think it's about 5 years. DAR was putting out reports, and they had questionable results. The way that they were talking about fish populations was really outdated. So I think that they just kind of kept pushing the fishery behind those reports, without actually really, doing major environmental assessments on the specific species that are being taken, and things like that. So they just kind of went with DAR's reports, and I personally just don't think that's enough. And I think it reflects when we swim on our reefs, those reports aren't enough. We're not seeing enough fish on our reefs. So.
Oh, for sure. I apologize. I feel like I've been hijacking this
no worries.
questions. I'll let anyone else ask questions.
No worries, Megan. I'm actually really enjoying listening to this conversation, so that it's helpful to hear this kind of dialogue. My questions for you, Sienna, are not necessarily related anymore directly to your content. It's more towards your methodology, and I don't think that it's important that that's on this recorded video. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to reach out to you in email again.
Okay.
And ask you those things. And then I think I went back to our email exchange back in April or whenever that was.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe you were going to send me your report when it was finished and approved. So yeah, if you could still send me that. Your work is incredibly helpful for what I'm trying to do. And you're the only person that I've so far have been in contact with that is, I think, setting it up the way that I need to set up my work that I haven't seen yet. So it's just really helpful for me to see this in your final product. So thank you. And also thank you for putting me in contact with Carly, because that was also helpful. So that's all, but I'll reach out to you in email and with my methodology questions.
Okay, awesome.
Yeah.
Sounds good, Alexis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think this example is really good because of the stakeholder discussion.
Yeah,
because
it's really unique.
BCAs do not break it down by these stakeholder groups.
Yeah. That
distributional issue is, I think, what sells this paper. because I don't think people realize, and this happens all the time, how the people are just getting slowly nagged out of a little bit here and a little bit there to benefit certain, in this case, business interests. And then the legislators are just seduced by this idea of, oh, jobs.
Yeah.
But no one ever says exactly how, you know, they don't really come out and say how many jobs.
Yeah.
And exactly what, you know, and like this value add, which is the big no-no in sustainability, to be doing all this, you know, value add outside of the state, because that just is a kiss of death if you want to do economic growth and development. So very interesting. And, you know, I think that's why I like this. Also, the data, all the data she used was some sort of secondary source. Like she went to a paper, or she scanned the internet for prices, or, you know, we really did a lot of grubbing just to get secondary data. Because if you try to do original research, you're going to be here forever.
Yeah.
I mean, it really takes a lot of time. So our idea is that community groups could do some of this themselves if they knew how to really structure these groups. Because if you look at these, like these retail prices, she just went and got prices, and then we tried to actually estimate the markups based on the local price and the mainland price. And that's just secondary data. Like, we didn't have to get permission to get this data. It's publicly available. You just have to know how to make the case. And that's a lot of times what these small nonprofits or government agencies, they really don't know how to do this kind of stuff. So that's really important, to try and get as much as you can without having to do primary research, because it's expensive and it takes so much time. This non-market valuation, we didn't do it in this paper that much. We tried to rely on secondary estimate, you know, secondary data estimated by somebody else, or we tried to just describe it. And she actually pulled the ranges, right, from the data, or interviewed people and just asked their opinion.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's very useful. So you see actually the NPV scenarios that she constructed. And the spreadsheets are not that complicated, because we really didn't get that much data, because we had these big stakeholder groups, right? So you have the tourism losses. You know, you can actually quantify all this stuff pretty nicely, so it looks really good. So this is the actual NPV spreadsheet that went in. And of course, you notice it didn't even show up in the presentation, just the conclusions.
Yeah. Yeah, these are a lot of numbers, but I'd say I'm not really an economist. You know, Dr. Cox is, like, she knows what she's doing. But, you know, I took the class that you guys are taking right now, and this wasn't, I mean, that really helped me set this up, but this was in some ways easier for me to do, because there wasn't like crazy discounting from, you know, different things. So actually this looks like really intense, but I'm not an economist. I'm not really a math person, and I was able to do this. And Dr. Cox basically just looked it over and was like, yep, we're good to go. So
wow.
Yeah, so
encouraging.
Sort of, that's how it went.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of questions. I ask a lot of questions because I don't, you know, I don't always know what I'm doing.
Well, again, if you notice, once you get the data on the stakeholder groups, then you're not plugging in that many numbers.
Yeah.
Right? Because we only have 8 stakeholder groups.
Yeah, and then what I did in my actual paper is that I discussed each of these costs or benefits. I discussed them in depth, where I got the information, how I came up with the numbers, how I came up with high end versus low end. Like, for example, management costs. I reached out to DLNR probably 8 times over email, and on the 8th time, they gave me some management numbers, and I was like, okay, can I follow up with a high end and a low end? And they, you know, provided me that. So you know, you just have to be persistent and be creative when it comes to figuring out what you're going to put in your tables. But
actually, she did a very good qualitative discussion of the damage to the reefs. Cited a lot of papers which really pointed out this kind of ecological nature of this reef stuff, so that you can't just take these fish out and think it's not going to affect the whole operation. And so there was a lot of references. There was a lot of discussion about the Hawaiian culture. you know, all the fish. She gave all the Hawaiian names in that one slide you just showed. So, you know, a lot of this was just attention to making it really be authentic, because if they didn't have Hawaiian names, then they probably really would not be valued with Hawaiian culture. But because most of them did, you can be sure that at some point there is some cultural significance, or they wouldn't have had these names.
Yeah.
So we didn't have to beat it with a stick. I mean, you can talk about it and cite sources, and it's very, very credible when you read the qualitative, descriptive kind of, we didn't get numbers, but by the time you get to the end of it, when you see this huge, big positive number for the ban and all these huge negative numbers, it's just sells so nicely. You know, the qualitative descriptions really sell this paper, I think.
I might have missed this. I'm so sorry if I didn't. You already said this, but did you present this to the state in any form or way?
No, I have a few of my past classmates and colleagues who work at the state, and they really wanted me to. And when I reached out persistently to do that, because I really wanted to share this, and they weren't that interested.
Well, of course.
Yeah, they said, you know, I think we have all we need with the EIS, and I said, okay, sure. So yeah, I mean, I tried. I really did try, and I did share it with them. I sent it to them. So I don't know, like, in what capacity, you know, they use that information.
Amy asked you to present it, didn't she?
Yeah, Amy asked me. Cole put in a word. I sent it, you know, to all my contacts over there. But yeah, I unfortunately they didn't want to hear it. So.
Well, actually, when we see the Society for Benefit Cost Analysis, you see they are still trying to get past this kind of resistance because they don't understand it, where an EIS, an environmental impact study or statement, they kind of have worked with for years.
Yeah.
And it's not particularly full of evidence.
Yeah.
So you don't have to feel like you're put on the spot, right?
Yeah. And the issue with, I don't know, they love those EISs, and I have such an issue with EISs, don't get me started. But the fact that the EIS was done by an entity that, you know, is a multi-billion-dollar corporation that, you know, revolves around this industry was really concerning. And you can see when you read the EIS that they talk a lot about, oh, the client, you know, didn't want to explore a ban or a moratorium. So how is that, you know, looking out for the best interest of stakeholders or the environment when you're only exploring recommendations that are approved by the client, who is this multi-million-dollar pet industry corporation? So I don't know why this system is like this, but it's very concerning.
So are you alluding to that being one of your major concerns with EISs in general, is the fact that they're predominantly ran through an agenda?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I always, you know, supported EIS. I'm like, oh, they should do an EIS for that. You know, it's kind of like, as a environmental manager, you're wired to say, oh, you know, that needs an EIS. You know, before they approve that, an EIS needs to be done. But the problem is that the state isn't funding the EIS. Right. The EIS needs to be funded and approved by whoever the highest bidder is. So, you know, stakeholders don't have the money, or you know, they don't know the system well enough to, you know, to pay for something like that or to orchestrate something like that. So it comes down to, you know, who has, you know, the most money to do that, who has the most resources to do that. And it's always going to be the big corporation who steps up, you know, to do the EIS.
So I'm blanking her name right now, one of Kumu Hanava's other graduate students that did the work with on Kauai with Hei'ia Fish Pond, or not Hei'ia Fish Pond, sorry.
Water quality word.
Amy Markle?
Amy?
I was in Mehana's lab, so.
Oh, okay. I'm just wondering if
Hannah was Sienna's advisor.
yeah. Oh, okay. I'm just wondering if a way to kind of alleviate that barrier of community members being able to kind of direct these EISs is through subsistence fishing areas, community-based CBFAs, and how Mehana's work could probably tie into that. What do you think about that? Kind of like if more coastal lines or fishing areas where sorry, I'm just like losing my
I think I know where you're going with that. I think that the problem is that like the way that the state is set up is that the EIS is always going to be that defining factor of whether, you know, we should move forward with whatever management system. You know
okay,
I mean?
that's where I'm getting at. So if the community has the authority or jurisdiction to manage and you know, maintain a particular fishing coastline, then through that agreement with the state, wouldn't that just like an EIS analysis, wouldn't that automatically then just fall into the hands of the community if that partnership was identified?
If they can't fund it, then it won't be
oh, right. Yeah.
So essentially the state is looking for bidders who want to do the EIS. So in the case of this fishery, I don't know who the other bidders were, but the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council put in a bid of a certain amount of money to do the EIS. And so they won that bid, and they hired Stantec, which is a consulting firm like on the mainland somewhere. So Stantec, the consulting firm, did the EIS for the applicant, which was the Pet Industry Joint Advisory Council. So when they're talking about their recommendations, you know, they take into account their client. That's who's paying them to do their work. So if you go ahead and read the EIS, which I wish I could send it to you, but it's like 300 something pages, so it doesn't exactly send over email. You have to go and download it off the internet, and it takes a lot of storage on your laptop, by the way. If you read through that, I mean, it's so clear that, you know, they talk about, you know, the applicant's wants and what their needs are, and it revolves around, like I alluded to earlier, those direct market benefits, which are jobs and taxes. So they mentioned Hawaiian culture. They interviewed all of these amazing people who said that we don't support the fishery. And then their final statement on that was, you know, these people don't support the fishery, but is it impacting Hawaiian culture? No, it's not. It has very little impact. So so it's okay. So it's very concerning.
Let me just say, when you hire a consultant, the job of the consultant is give the client what they want. And you want to do it as fast as possible, get your money and go home. Because you're there to make money, you're a consultant. And these guys can spew out hundreds of pages because this is what they do for a living. And you try to do it with a community, particularly one that's maybe indigenous and maybe not as sophisticated as rolling words off your tongue or off a page. It's very hard to deal with it because they're going to look at that report. They're not going to listen to, particularly Hawaiians. It's a spoken thing. Writing is not high up on the list. So this makes it very, very difficult, I think.
Yeah, and when you're handed an EIS, you think, oh, this is I don't know, you think it's just an accepted document. You think, when I think of an EIS, I think of a standardized document. And I feel like that's what we're kind of predisposed to think when we think EIS. We're like, oh, this is done by a professional. This is, you know, up to a certain standard, and it's not. And so we kind of have to let go of that. And it's going to be hard, though, for politicians to understand or, you know, to change that. It's very ingrained in our system right now, especially in Hawaii, because we do a lot of EISs for a lot of different things.
I think you also have to understand that politicians, my general thing is if you can't read it in 10 minutes.
Yeah, it's not happening.
So I wonder if you could like, sorry.
You know what I mean? They need it's that's why we have lobbyists to sit and tell them things. It's crazy.
It has to be a brief.
Yeah, you have to have an executive summary.
Yeah.
Yes. I'm learning that. I'm doing some work for OHA right now, and they make me write these like 50-page reports, but then they tell me make sure everything's only in the first, like on the first page, because that's all we're going to read. And so it's like, what?
I know. You start to really wonder what's the point of this.
Yeah, I do all the time. And that's why I have recently actually been really just questioning why, like, do I need to be pursuing this degree? Like, can I be more productive, you know, in other places? But Sienna, just seeing your work and seeing the final product again is just really motivating for me and gives me a clear idea of where I'm headed. But I'm wondering if you could like strategically manipulate, since they do it to us, we can do it to them, and screenshot that one slide that you have of like where you're comparing the EIS and the BCA, and just like send an email out to whoever you think is most applicable for that. Yeah. And, you know, introduce the desire to present this research to them, and that, hey, I pulled out this EIS and went through deep into the EIS. I think there might be some stuff that you guys, that could be helpful in consideration when moving forward, so that they know that like you're coming, you know, like pretend that you're coming from like an EIS standpoint, and then.
Yeah, I mean, when I understand what you're going with, but when I initially reached out to them, it was actually a week before the hearing where they were going to discuss and vote on the EIS. So it was actually, time was really of the essence. I wasn't finished with my report yet. I had to like jam it out and then send it over and say, hey, you know, this isn't like, you know, this isn't completely done yet, but I got my MEM. It's, you know, I can give you the report. Like, can we discuss it? Can I present to you? And they didn't even want to hear it then, which concerned me, because they were going to make a big decision on it. And I wanted them to at least hear me out. Yeah, so I don't know why it's so hard to
change is hard.
Yeah, to get in there, but
and I'm asking you these questions just because it's I'm taking it as personal advice. And so now, real quick, I'm also just curious, because this comes up a lot in my research with my graduate advisor, Susan, and I often have to have her advocate on my behalf because I'm just a graduate student. Right. So Linda, did you ever try to reach out to the state?
No, I didn't, because I'm an extension specialist, so I don't have a research reputation.
Yeah.
So I didn't
ask that. I didn't ask that of Dr. Cox either. My personal experience is that you should reach out yourself, because those networks and those connections should be coming from you. You're a graduate student, but you're a professional as well, and you need to present yourself as one, so that, you know, when they see your research down the line, they know who you are. So it's kind of like name recognition. You know, you're not always going to have Dr. Crow, you know.
The other thing is you need to establish credentials for yourself.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
So Sienna is very interested in this topic, and she literally drove us all nuts for about 3 years, because this is all she talked about. From the minute she hit the program until we got her out, this is her shtick. So, I mean, if you knew her and her family, we all sat there and listened. So I think it's really important that this is something that she owns, because now she's going to law school. So this is kind of her, you know, her first claim to fame, as it were. And
and Dr. Cox is my co-author, because it's important to include those who actually, you know, actively participated in your research and lifted you up. But I totally agree with Dr. Cox. I think that even if you find that in some ways the program doesn't challenge you or doesn't suit, you know, what your goals are, you don't think you're getting high enough, I think just go above and beyond and make different connections however you can, especially when you have like networking opportunities in your lab or via email. You know, you have NREM graduate student at the bottom of your, under your name. So you have an additional, just try to get in there when you can.
And then communicate as much as you can in different formats, because so many people will see something I wrote and remember my name. Oh, I would go to meetings and people go, oh, you wrote this obscure newsletter article 3 years ago. And I'd be like, okay, yeah, I did do that. You never know what hits people. You never know what moves them. Yeah.
And Dr. Cox too was telling me about, she wrote different briefs and then they were posted to the CTAR website or something like that. And people were accessing her research in that way, like in like a 1 or 2 page brief.
Yeah, I posted some of them. Like I call it toilet reading. So if you can read it in 10 minutes, then that's probably good enough, and get this take home message. And then one of my students told me I was like Martha Stewart because I just repackage everything. In different formats and different like examples and
condensed versions, and different titles. So I send a lot of different drafts.
Because not everybody learns the same. They may not hit on it the first time you tell them, but the third time maybe they do hit on it. So it's a persistent game. The other thing is Susan Crowe is known for soil science, and maybe what you're talking about is more of a
energy reform,
a different topic. You know what I'm saying?
So
it might not be an area where you want her to advocate for you because that's not her area. She's very good at what she does. She is a great soil ecologist. Everybody in the whole, and trust me, I tell you, I was head of the promotion committee when she got promoted and everybody in the world knew it. But to be that well known, you have to focus on a very tiny thing, and you're focusing on a tinier thing that's different.
I think you should, like, my one other piece of advice would be to find other mentors who are interested in the same thing that you're studying. Because, for example, Dr. Cox, my advisor at the time didn't have any experience in cost benefit analysis or the specifics of what I was doing. And so as far as like my actual nuts and bolts of my project, I couldn't get help there. And so if I didn't have Dr. Cox, this would have been a very different ball game, a very different piece of work. So I would definitely advocate for you to find people, professors and whoever else who are, specifically interested in the type of research that you're trying to do, and stick to them and ask a lot of questions and, forge those relationships, because if this is what you want to do in your career or moving forward and you want to have these skills, you want to have, a network of people who can, support you and uplift you and get you into different positions. And Dr. Cox wrote my letter of rec for law school, so.
Oh my God.
It must have been good, I guess. I don't know.
It must have been good.
Thank you guys so much for this. This is really helpful.
Yeah, so it's all about finding someone with the same passion, Alexis. Or at least a passionate teacher ready to support what you're doing and take the time, because it was incredibly time consuming.
I saw Dr. Cox in the hallway during my second semester of being an MEM student. And I said, I think I'm going to do a policy analysis. And she said, sounds like you should do a CBA. And I was like, what's that? So you got to just,
I think that one, and then you ran through a couple of advisors even before then. It was weird. It happens though, weird paths.
Okay.
So but again, you have to say, now, what am I doing? What is my passion here? What do I want to get out of this?
Yeah. I might need to revisit that for myself just to make sure I'm clear with what it is I'm trying to accomplish. Yeah.
Because you have to stay focused, because it's really easy to get distracted in these programs.
Jordan and I were going to partner on this project for this class, and we're talking about doing like the H power stuff that we've been discussing in some of our recent lectures. And I got a big slap on my wrist for even advocating to do that, because that was not supposed to be why I took this course. I need to do the project on my data for my capstone. So I'm seeing how I'm a very passionate human. And so it's very easy for passion to sway me off course sometimes. So it's, your advice is really grounding. I do have just one more question real quick. And it was from the email that you sent me back in April, Sienna. You mentioned a booklet that Linda provided you that you printed out and had bounded. And I'm just wondering, Linda, is that the intro to BCA report? Is that the book? I just want to make sure I'm not missing out on resources.
Yeah, I think it is. I have it somewhere. But I'm pretty sure it's, Linda, you sent it to me before the semester.
Yeah, you said it was sent out before the semester started.
Oh, I don't even remember.
Yeah, that's what I used.
I'll look at my email.
I referenced that.
This is what happens. I can't remember. I got so much going on.
Yeah, I just want to make sure I have that resource.
Yeah, I used that. And for my specific research, I followed the Eightfold Path, which I didn't take Dr. Olison's course on policy analysis, but my friend Alohi did. So I used her book, The Eightfold Path by Bardach, I think is the last name, Bardach. So yeah, I can send you those things too, but it'll all be in my reference list as well.
Awesome.
Yeah, it's a lot of work, but again, it just takes a lot of thinking also.
Yeah, and it evolved a lot. I feel like when I was like, hey, like I'm finding these numbers, they're really skewed. Like this must mean that we're losing a lot of money. That's when Dr. Cox was like, oh, well, let's talk about these equity issues, and then it evolved into a stakeholder
power structures.
Yeah, adding market structure, power structure. Yeah, so it just evolves the more you find out about your topic.
I'm so excited.
Yeah, it did take us a while.
Yeah.
But that's again my new favorite word from the Society of Benefit Cost Analysis is evidence-based.
Yeah.
We need evidence, and that's what a BCA provides, is evidence.
Yep.
Okay, anyone has more questions, comments? Okay, so Sienna, if you give me back the host.
Okay, I don't know how to do
Thank
that.
you so much, Sienna. This is fantastic.
No worries, Megan.
Go to participants, and you'll hit participants, and you'll get a list to the side of the participants, or maybe stop the screen share first.
Okay, hold on. How do I stop the screen share?
No. View options maybe on the top. Do you have a bar across the top?
Share, stop share.
Yes.
Okay.
So then you should see, if you hit participants, there's a list of participants down the side.
Right.
So you can click on it, the participant, and you should be able to go to
I think
more. Hit me.
You're the host now. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. I am the host now. Okay, good. That went surprisingly well. So thank you for doing that. And so now everyone can see all my harping about all this distributional stuff and who wins and who loses and power. And oh boy, we were hot in the middle of it for 2 years.
Yep.
So any more questions? Okay, so we're going to end the meeting. So thank you, Sienna. And and then I will have the video and I can file drop it.
Okay, awesome. Thank you, everyone.
Then that way you'll have it.
Thank you.
Awesome.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye.
Bye.